I was folding laundry when I first heard that song. Who tends the orchards? Who fixes up the gables? Emotional torture from the head of your high table. My hands froze mid-fold, still gripping one of Mark's pristine dress shirts. Tears splashed onto the cotton before I even realized I was crying. 12 years of marriage, and some stranger on the radio had just put into perfect words what I'd been too afraid to admit. I wasn't Mark's wife. I was his servant, his nurse, his therapist, his maid. Everything except a partner. But that's not why I'm telling this story. I'm telling this story because last month I almost killed my husband. It wasn't premeditated. I didn't slip anything into his food or tamper with his brakes. What happened was far more complicated than that. But before I tell you about that night, you need to understand how a woman who once graduated top of her class from nursing school ended up contemplating murder in her own kitchen. The irony doesn't escape me. As a trauma nurse, I was trained to recognize the signs of abuse. I could spot a fabricated story about a broken arm from across the ER. I knew all the statistics, all the patterns, all the red flags. But love makes you colorblind, especially to red. I still remember the night Mark was brought into my ER. He'd been in a car accident, nothing serious, just a broken arm and mild concussion. But something about him was different from my usual patients. Maybe it was the way he maintained his dignity even in that flimsy hospital gown, or how he asked about my day while I was setting his arm. It must be exhausting, he'd said, carrying everyone else's pain. No one had ever acknowledged that before. The emotional labor of nursing. I should have recognized it for what it was. Reconnaissance. Mark wasn't seeing me. He was studying me, learning exactly which buttons to push. Our first date was at Le Petit Jardin, the kind of restaurant where the menu doesn't list prices. I remember feeling underdressed in my best dress, which probably cost less than the wine he ordered. "You look uncomfortable," he'd observed, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "Let me help you with the menu." I know it can be overwhelming for someone who's not used to this level of dining. That was Mark's specialty, making his control feel like care, making his judgments feel like guidance, making his demands feel like love. We married 6 months later. I kept working at the hospital, but gradually my shifts decreased. Mark always had a rational explanation. We needed me at home more. The house was too big to manage alone. His career was at a crucial point. Each reason sounded logical in isolation. Together, they were links in a chain that bound me to our home. The first miscarriage happened 2 years into our marriage. I was 8 weeks along. Mark held me through the night as I cried, whispering that it wasn't my fault. 2 months later, he used that same gentle voice to suggest that maybe the stress of nursing wasn't good for my reproductive health. The second miscarriage broke something in me. The third nearly destroyed me. But it was the fourth that opened my eyes. Not the loss itself, but Mark's reaction to it. I was in the bathroom, bleeding and sobbing. Through the door, I heard him on the phone with his mother. Yes, she lost another one. I don't know what she's doing wrong. Maybe if she took better care of herself. That night, I cried myself to sleep while he worked late at the office. The next morning, he left a list of fertility supplements on the kitchen counter, along with a new cleaning schedule. "A clean home makes a healthy home," he'd written at the bottom. But it was Lily who really made me see the truth. She came into the ER one night during my final month of work, before Mark convinced me to quit for our future family. 23 years old, broken ribs, the kind of bruises that don't come from walking into a door. "I'm so clumsy," she'd said, the same rehearsed line I'd heard 1,000 times. I was checking her vitals when she grabbed my hand. "Your husband?" she whispered. "Does he tell you you're clumsy too?" The question hit me like a physical blow, because Mark did. Always with a laugh, always with that concerned look. "Careful, darling, you're so clumsy sometimes." Every time I broke something, dropped something, failed at something, he was there to reinforce the narrative. I was clumsy, careless, incapable. I never saw Lily again after that night, but her words stayed with me, a splinter in my mind that wouldn't heal over. Then came my accident. The fall down the stairs that left me with 3 cracked ribs and a broken wrist. I still don't remember exactly how I fell. Funny how trauma works like that. But I remember lying there, struggling to breathe, hearing Mark on the phone upstairs. "Yeah, Jim, I'll still make the meeting." "No, it's fine. Sarah just had a little fall. You know how clumsy she can be." He didn't take me to the hospital, said he had an important presentation, left me there with some Tylenol and a glass of water I couldn't even reach. That's when something in me began to crack. Something deeper than bones. The next 6 weeks were a study in survival. Every movement was agony, but Mark's demands didn't stop. The house still needed to be perfect. His meals still needed to be served. His life still needed to be maintained. "I don't understand," he'd say, watching me struggle to breathe through the pain. "Why aren't you better yet? The house is a mess." I started having dreams about Lily. In them, she was always trying to tell me something, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of breaking bones. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my ribs screaming, wondering if she'd ever made it out, wondering if I would. The breaking point came during my recovery. I was in the kitchen, trying to prepare dinner one-handed, when he came home early. I dropped a pot, couldn't bend to pick it up with my ribs still healing. He found me there, crying from pain and frustration. Instead of helping, he stepped over me to reach the coffee maker. "When you're done with your drama," he said, "I need you to iron my blue suit for tomorrow's meeting." That's when I saw the knife block on the counter. So close, so easy. In that moment, I understood every news story I'd ever read about women who snapped. The weight of the blade would have been nothing compared to the weight I'd been carrying. I reached for it. Actually reached for it. But then that song came on the radio I always kept playing in the kitchen. That line about emotional torture from the head of the high table. About doing too much labor. All day, every day, therapist, mother, maid, nymph, then virgin, nurse, then a servant. Just an appendage, live to attend him. The lyrics wrapped around me like a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of an abyss. Each word was a mirror, reflecting back the reality I'd been too afraid to name. I started laughing. The kind of laugh that's really a scream in disguise. Mark turned around, coffee cup in hand. "What's wrong with you?" "Nothing," I said, still laughing. "Nothing at all. I just realized something. You didn't ruin my life. I've been ruining it myself by staying, by doing your labor, by letting you treat me like this." He set down his cup using that careful, controlled movement I'd come to recognize as danger. "You're being hysterical. This isn't you." "No," I said, rising slowly, ribs screaming. "This is exactly me. The real me. The one you've been trying to kill for 10 years, but guess what? She's not dead. She's just been waiting." I walked out of that kitchen, out of that house, out of that life. I didn't take anything except my nursing license, which I'd kept renewed all these years without him knowing. My own secret act of rebellion. The next morning, I checked into a motel across town and made 2 calls, one to a divorce lawyer, one to my old nursing supervisor. By evening, I had both legal representation and a job offer. That was 6 weeks ago. I'm back in nursing now, working nights in the ER. There's a certain poetry to it, returning to the place where this all began. But this time, I'm stronger, wiser. When I treat women with injuries they can't quite explain, I see in their eyes what I used to see in my mirror. I tell them about that song, about labor that isn't love, about how the choice between murder and escape isn't really a choice at all. Sometimes I tell them about Lily, wondering if she's out there somewhere, free. Last week, I treated a woman with a broken wrist. Her husband hovered nearby, explaining how clumsy she was. I waited until he went to get coffee, then slipped her my card with the domestic violence hotline number written on the back. "You're not clumsy," I whispered, "and you're not alone." To the woman listening to this who recognizes herself in my words, you don't have to reach for the knife. You don't have to do the labor. You don't have to disappear. The way out isn't through violence, it's through the door. I still don't know if Mark ever realized how close he came to becoming a headline, how near he was to having his perfect life end in perfect tragedy. Sometimes I think about sending him that song, but I won't. He doesn't deserve to know how his story almost ended. Instead, I play it during my night shifts, letting its truth reach the women who need to hear it. And every time I hear those lyrics about emotional torture and too much labor, I thank whatever force stopped me from grabbing that knife. Because the real tragedy wouldn't have been his death. It would have been the death of who I really am. The death I was already dying, piece by piece, day by day, in the labor of maintaining his perfect world. So no, I didn't kill my husband. I saved myself instead. And somewhere out there, I hope Lily did too,